This is a video for the injury response process for Therapeutic Interventions 1. And just to start, I'm gonna provide a broad overview on the injury response process, but it's important to note that I'm not gonna talk through everything that's in Chapter 1 of the textbook. So please make sure you go back and review the first few pages on your own with the stress theories and the different types of tissues, because all of that is going to be really important as we start getting into talking about how certain tissues are damaged and what happens as a result of inflammation or the inflammatory process, and then also how we are managing care for those tissues and what interventions we'll use. So to get started, I want you to think about what inflammation is. Typically when we think about inflammation, we think about swelling, we think about some sort of tissue damage, but really it's the body's response to an injury. And really it's a protection mechanism. So when tissue is damaged, the body's going to respond to, one, start the healing process, but two, to protect the area from further damage. So it's just this natural response. So the cardinal signs of inflammation, if you're not familiar with these, are heat, redness, swelling, pain, and loss of function. And these are all going to be a result of the inflammatory process. So as we start going through here, I'm really going to kind of walk through the different steps. It's important to note that all of these things don't necessarily happen in a specific, well, they do happen in a sequence, but as the tissue starts to die, the sequence kind of restarts. So it's a little bit of a cyclical process versus everything happening in a perfect sequence. So obviously, to have the inflammatory process start, we have to have some sort of primary injury. So some sort of structural damage that causes the injury to occur. And this can happen via macro trauma or micro trauma. So macro trauma is a large force over a short period of time. So like our acute types of injuries would be considered macro trauma, whereas micro trauma is going to be small repetitive stresses over a prolonged period of time. So those chronic type injuries, a really good example of the difference between the two would be like an acute fracture versus a stress fracture. So as a result of that primary injury, we have some sort of structural change. So if we use fracture as our example, that break in the bone or the structural change to the bone really gets the process going. And this structural change, one, causes cell membrane disruption, and essentially this starts the whole cascade of the cycle. So the body recognizes that there's some sort of change and kind of sends out all these warning signals to start the inflammatory process. And again, a result of the primary injury, but we also have secondary injury, which I'm going to touch on later. But essentially, when we think about the cycle as a group, secondary injury also causes an ultra structural change. So the first step in this process, after we have the tissue damage that occurs, is chemical mediators are released. So we get this release of norepinephrine, and then we get release of a whole host of other types of chemical mediators. So histamine, bradykinin, and the goal is really to modify and regulate the inflammatory process. So the body senses that there's some sort of tissue damage, and we're going to send in basically all the troops to treat that area. It's important to note here that the body assumes that there's going to be some sort of bacterial infection, so they really send an overload of mediators to the area based on what's actually needed. So if you think about like some sort of urgent crisis, we send firefighters, paramedics, police, all these people into that type of emergency situation, but not all the time are all of those different groups of, sorry, that was a horrible sentence. All of those groups of people aren't always needed. So essentially we've got this excess of people that's really causing congestion and actually sometimes causing more problem than good. So then we get hemodynamic changes, and these are changes to the size of the blood vessels. So immediately following injury, we get this initial phase of vasoconstriction. And if you think about why that likely occurs, the body is trying to prevent a loss of a rapid loss of blood flow. So this immediate response is for the local blood vessels within the area where the injury occurs to decrease in size to limit blood flow to the area, essentially so the body doesn't bleed out. That only lasts for about 10 minutes, and then after that you actually get vasodilation or increasing size of all the blood vessels because we're trying to rush nutrients, these chemical mediators and everything to the area so that we can start the healing process. So within this process we have coagulation also happening. So this is, if you think about like a surface level cut or abrasion, this is where the scar really starts to form, or we're trying to get that platelet plug to form to stop the bleeding or stop the blood loss that's occurring. So we get a formation of the platelet plug, and this essentially happens through a release of mediators, but we have prothrombin that is converted to thrombin because of the action of factor X, which is an enzyme. So you have this basically enzyme that's acting on prothrombin, causes it to form into thrombin, and then that thrombin acts on fibrinogen. So you have this like cluster of fibrin filaments, and when the thrombin acts on the fibrinogen, it causes that fibrinogen to break down into individual fibers, and then the fibers essentially are going to kind of pile on top of each other and form this lattice over the injury site, which is where you get the platelet plug formation. So everything just kind of haphazard falls over the top to decrease the amount of blood loss that's happening. And that's occurring while this entire cascade of inflammation is happening. So we also have metabolic changes that are occurring. And the metabolic changes are, as a result of injury, we get this increase in metabolism of the cells. So they're working really hard to basically keep functioning. But because of all this congestion that's happening in the area, and because of the decrease in oxygen that's present, that occurs, all of the cells are going to actually switch from anaerobic metabolism to anaerobic metabolism. And then if they don't have enough nutrients to be able to continue to function, the cells are going to die. And that is where secondary cell death occurs. So when we talk about secondary injury, it's not a second injury per se. It occurs as part of the primary injury, but it's kind of this cascade that causes additional cell death. So when a cell dies because it doesn't have enough energy, it's going to restart the inflammatory process from the beginning. So that is another ultrastructural change that's going to kind of loop back around and cause the cascade to happen again. As a result of some of these metabolic changes, we also get a change in the sodium-potassium pump that's happening within the cells. So essentially the cell function is going to be completely altered because our metabolism has increased and our nutrients and oxygen availability is decreased as a result of the injury. We also have permeability changes within the cells, or within the blood vessels. As I mentioned, those chemical mediators are released. Histamine and bradykinin are going to increase the permeability of the blood vessels, which is going to allow the cell walls to contract and kind of pull away from each other, which means that gaps are left. And the purpose of this is to allow white blood cells to get out through the vessels and to the injury site. But it's important to note that it's not discriminative into what gets out. So while white blood cells are moving out, there's also space for other types of fluids to get out, and that's really where a swelling starts to occur. So as I mentioned, we have white blood cells that are moving outside of the blood vessels. This is also considered leukocyte migration. So typically, when blood flows, the white blood cells kind of flow right down the middle, but they're going to start to move to the outside of those blood vessels and then start to leak out of those blood vessels. And they squeeze through the gaps because the white blood cells are really trying to get to the area to start to heal the tissue. And then we have phagocytosis that occurs. So this is the digestion of cellular debris. So those white blood cells are getting to the area and starting to clean up and heal the tissue or remove the dead or dying tissue. And this entire acute inflammation phase usually lasts somewhere between 24 to 48, sometimes up to 72 hours for this whole process to occur. So as I mentioned before, we have secondary injury. So the first mechanism that we talked about was this hypoxic secondary injury, which occurs as a result of the increase in cell metabolism that causes cell death because there's not enough oxygen and nutrients available. But we also have enzymatic cell death, and that occurs, enzymatic secondary cell death. Let me go ahead here. So this occurs as a result of all of those chemical mediators. The initial mediators that go to the site can't necessarily differentiate between the healthy and the unhealthy tissue. And as I mentioned earlier, the body's going to respond as if it's like a bacterial infection, that we could get this systemic septic shock, basically. And all of these mediators are trying to go in and clean up the bad stuff, but they don't differentiate between the bad and the good. So they actually start to clean up healthy tissue, which causes cell death to occur. So that's a second form of secondary injury. All right, and then we get into proliferation and tissue healing. So this is kind of the healing process. So as phagocytosis is occurring, we also have proliferation happening. So this first part of proliferation is where we get this vascular network that's going to kind of form over the site. So we'll get an increase in capillaries that kind of bud and form together, kind of like a chain link fence. And the goal of this is to bring an increase in oxygen and nutrients to the area to promote new tissue growth. We also get, we also get this formation of, this lattice formation of collagen fibers that just kind of lays down. And the goal is really to kind of start to structure the tissue healing and get that to occur. And this proliferation process can last anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks up to 3 to 6 months, depending on the type of tissue. And then maturation or remodeling, this is kind of after the tissue has healed, but we're putting stresses on the tissue. So if you look at the two pictures here, the picture on the left is this loose stack of rubber bands. So this is what that initial proliferation phase looks like, where we're essentially just throwing these fibers down in kind of a haphazard way, and they're not organized, just to get the tissue to heal. But as we start to stress the tissue, those fibers are going to start to realign. So if you think about putting your hands in the middle of those rubber bands, if you pull apart the ones on the left, they're just all going to kind of slide apart, so there's not a lot of strength there. But if we continue to stress the tissue and get those to realign, the fibers to realign, if I put my fingers in the rubber bands on the right and try and pull apart, I'm going to have more resistance there because all the bands are resisting in the same motion. So as we get later in the rehab process, we want to actually stress the tissue to promote this realignment. So this is kind of the general overview of the inflammatory process. Make sure you go back and review this in the textbook. There's a lot of details in there, but some of the sticking points, it's just kind of hard to pull out some of this information. So please take some time and go back and look at that.